Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and uncontrolled desire. O blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, so that the outside may become clean as well. Now, we've been pretty tough on the Pharisees as a whole these last 7 weeks. But this week, the house of Hillel, the liberal faction of Phariseeism in the first centuries BCE and CE, is going to take a bit of a breather until next week when they get compared to whitewashed tombs. Or maybe this week if I have enough time to cover the 5th and 6th woes of Matthew 23. We'll just see. Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome to Character in Context, where we explore the historical context of Scripture and talk about how it bears on our own behavior and witness as image bearers. Did you know that we can find ourselves in every horrible negative character in the Bible? We can. Actually, I ought to give a plug for my friend Matthew Vanderels. He has a YouTube channel and a congregation in North Carolina, in Rock Hill, North Carolina, and he has this congregation called Founded in Truth, and that's the name of their YouTube channel. He has this series called Empathy for the Wicked, and he takes the most horrible characters in Scripture, and he shows how, we can empathize with them because you know what? We aren't as different as we would like to believe. Anyway, check him out, Matthew Vanderels. Great guy, good friend, and wonderful teacher. So anyway, back to my introduction. You can find my teachings, not just Matthew's, on the ancientbridge.com website and contextforkids.com, as well as my YouTube channels, which you can access from the websites. You can also access past broadcasts on my podcast channel, characterincontext.podbean.com, and my context books for adults and families. I call them dinner table curriculum because families go through them together, and they're all on the historical context of Scripture. And they're available through Amazon.com. I'll tell you something. It is thundering and lightning out there. I'm so tongue-tied today. It's just, I can't say accessible excess. Of course I can say it now, because I told you I couldn't. But now it's thundering and lightning out there, and we're going to see if this little portable studio my husband bought me will muffle the sound. So if you don't hear any thunder and lightning, you don't hear lightning. Just, there it went. If you didn't hear that, then this thing is awesome. Anyway, so this is part 6 of our series on the 7 woes of Matthew 23 and the 7th. If you include the teaching I squeezed in there about the Pharisees and scribes and who they were and were not, based on the biblical and extra-biblical writings that are available to us. There's a lot of actual people who wrote about the Pharisees, but they only wrote down stuff that they felt needed to be told. And when you're talking to people who are living in those times, you really don't need to give as much information as, say, we would like. So, now, a lot of misinformation and assumptions are floating around out there, and we're trying to get a little more light on the issues. For this week, I'm going to be referencing Jacob Neusner's article, First Cleanse the Inside, the halakhic background of a controversy saying, and thank goodness for that article because I've been pulling my hair out reading Mishnah tractate Kelim, which is the largest tractate in the entire Mishnah, which of course is the legal ruling half of the Talmud, and which was finally all compiled and codified around 200 of the Common Era. All that I said about tractate Shavuot, which was concerning oaths a couple of weeks back, being the worst, I was so wrong. This is far more nitpicky and maddening, and even with the excellent commentary by Pinchas Kehati, I was really struggling. Neusner came along and saved my hide with his article, and pointed me in the direction of a better source in Tractate Berakhot, which deals with blessings, which may not immediately seem to be applicable, but I promise it will make sense later. Now, if you decide to read Tractate Kelim with a good commentary, focus on chapter 25. I did not know that. So you know where I started reading, right? Chapter 1. And Kelim is all about utensils. And utensils aren't like what we would call, we say utensils is spatulas, ladles. No. In Mishnaic language, a utensil is a bed, a couch, a table, a spoon, a pot. It's anything you use. It's utilitarian. It's a utensil. It's really harkens back probably to the more truer meaning of the term. So, anyway, let's read this again, and we're going to read it in the Tree of Life version this week. I've been going back and forth. The Tree of Life version is a Messianic Jewish version, and it instead of scribes, it says Torah scholars. Sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's not so good, because not all scribes were Torah scholars. Okay, it was a professional class. If you go back to that teaching about the Pharisees and scribes. So we're going back to this is Matthew chapter 23, starting in verse 25. Woe to you, Torah scholars and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and uncontrolled desire. O blind Pharisee! First clean the inside of the cup and dish so that the outside may become clean as well. Now this is really interesting. This doesn't show up in the English, but all the woes so far have been addressed to a plural you. The Pharisees and scribes / Torah scholars as a group, except for one part of this one, and it's O blind Pharisee. First clean the inside of the cup and dish, so that the outside may become clean as well. And yes, it says Pharisee, but it's not obvious, because you can still say, oh, it's talking about the group. But no, in the Greek, it's very, very specifically directed to, it's like he's pointing at one guy. He's pointing at every individual, really. This is personal. Everything else has been directed toward the group. This one's personal. Woo! The house is shaken from the lightning, from the thunder and lightning. So, we have two options when we see a rebuke in the singular. We can say that the rebuke doesn't apply to everyone equally, or Yeshua, or you may call him Jesus, is making this a personal challenge, and I can argue both. So I will argue both, just to show you what is going on here. It's like, it's directed to you, but it's not like Yeshua is just pointing out one of them out of the crowd. It's like, hey, you, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, so that the outside may become clean as well. It doesn't apply to anyone but you. You're awful, Oh, shoot. No, it's rather like saying you guys are all hypocrites and then pointing to one guy and calling him out, or perhaps calling out a subgroup. Now, one of the important things about reading the Mishnah, which is the legal rulings of the Supreme Court of Israel, and the Gemara, which are the legal arguments, is that we see that even in Mishnaic times, getting close to 200 years after this incident, they're still debating these issues. Judaism is still evolving and changing and debating about things like ritual purity long after the destruction of the temple and the decline of the priesthood in importance. They haven't nailed down everything yet, and it will remain very much this way until the time of Maimonides in the 12th century, whose rulings on much of these issues is considered definitive. This guy was like this mega scholar. Not only was he a Talmudic scholar, but he was also a doctor, and he was some other things that's like, slacker. No, he's an overachiever. Anyway, at the time, 200 of the Common Era, however, and in the debates of the 2nd century especially, we see a lot of disagreement, and because of this, we know that Judaism was far from monolithic, when it still is far from monolithic. It's not, there isn't one kind of Judaism, and there never has been. Judaism after 30 of the common era evolved a lot from what we see being practiced by the scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, etc. And this is to be expected when a religion undergoes a catastrophe. And losing the temple was a catastrophe the likes of which we just can't imagine in this day of age. But going back to the rebuke, and I hope you got to hear my teaching on polemic in the ancient world. That was part 1. This sort of diatribe against hypocrisy and such of rival factions was common in the entire Greco-Roman world. The Greeks did it. The Romans did it. Jews did it too. It was part of the cultural fabric. The Essenes were probably the most prolific at it. It was like practically all they did wasn't all they did, but oh my gosh, their writings. Competition to be the only authoritative voice was common in the ancient world and is still common today, and undermining one's opponents by calling out their hypocrisy has always been effective. Now, Yeshua was in his last days here on earth, and he was addressing the Judeans and not his regular Galilean followers, although I'm sure the Galileans were there too. The Pharisees and their scribes / Torah scholars / teachers, as well as the Judean elites, were using their influence to keep the Judeans and Jerusalemites from listening to their Messiah. Now, they called themselves Guide the Blind, but they were blind to the answer to all their prayers, the coming of the Messiah. Now, we'll talk about that more in about 2 or 3 weeks. What should the Messiah do when the leaders of the people are leading the people in the wrong direction? He has to show the people that these guys are not the authority. He is. And that's what he was doing here, not criticizing them over honest disagreements or because he had a huge ego or low self-esteem or whatever, because he wanted to make more money from his sponsors on YouTube or on his webpage, right? He didn't want to sell books. I'm gonna pick on myself here too. He was battling for the salvation of his people. So was John the Baptist. They had unique callings and empowerment to do this. This wasn't about their flesh, like it generally is when we engage in this sort of thing. We enjoy being insulting, while they were fighting for people's lives. It's so important to understand their calling and motivation, especially when we say, well, I'm insulting people because Yeshua and John the Baptist did it. Are you doing it for the same reason? Do you have the same calling? Are you the voice of authority from God that they were? Are you right all the time like Yeshua is? Okay? Anyway, now this whole deal about the washing of the cups was about what the Bible calls cleanliness, but it is better termed ritual purity. This wasn't about having a dirty cup and washing it with soap. This was about ritual purity, about taking the steps to become nearer to God through ablutions, aka washing. And it's ritual washing, not like scrubbing, not like dishwasher washing. And the Pharisees were really concerned with 3 things. Overall, as far as all the writings go: ritual purity, Sabbath observance, and tithing. I'm not saying that they only cared about these things, but all the extra biblical sources where they're talked about really stress these things as their overriding concerns for reforming Jewish society. Remember, the Pharisees wanted to be the authorities within Judaism. They were really no different from any other religious faction throughout time, wanting to be the mainstream and not the fringe, wanting to determine the way of proper observance for everyone. But there were only about 6,000 of them altogether, and they did not have the authority of the later medieval rabbis. They were still just a faction within Judaism. Now, so what's ritual purity all about? Glad you asked. As I said before, it has nothing to do with actually being clean, but with about being in a ritually pure state that allowed one to approach God respectfully in person. Now, among new people to studying the Torah, there is a common misconception about what is and is not considered clean. For example, Unclean animals are actually only unclean after they're dead. They're unclean for food, as they were never meant to be eaten. It has nothing to do with how well you sanitize the meat or with your family practices. Unclean is just another word for unacceptable, but nothing is completely unacceptable. Well, almost nothing. Nothing God created is completely unacceptable. Let's put it that way. A lot of the things that humans do are completely unacceptable. Now, Yeshua and David both rode on unclean animals and remained undefiled. Donkeys and mules were unclean, but not for riding, only for eating. Leviticus 11 designates pigs as unclean for eating, but not to exterminate them as a species. Pigs serve a great purpose, as do all bottom feeders in the ocean, like lobsters, catfish, and shrimp. They're like nature's garbage disposals. And the more they are farmed out of the oceans and lakes, the dirtier the water gets, and the more trouble we have with water quality. God created this beautiful balance where some fish are for eating and some are for cleaning. But touching a pig or a dog or a cat does not make one ritually unclean, lest they're dead. So there's no scriptural prohibition on having pets. Let's look actually at the most common source of ritual uncleanness, which is sex. In Genesis 1, we are commanded to be fruitful and multiply, and in Leviticus, we are plainly told that any emission of semen from a man makes him and his wife unclean. Well, so obviously being unclean is not a sin, it's commanded. Also, a woman's monthly cycle renders her unclean. Natural biological function, and so obviously not a sin. Women couldn't have children if it wasn't for their monthly cycles. It would be impossible. Now, all of the different forms of uncleanness, except for a very few, were easily remedied by immersing in a mikvah, which is the Hebrew word for a ritual bath, and waiting until evening. At that point, one was clean again. No big hairy deal here. Now, clean for what? Leviticus 15 tells us that being clean is required to come near the holy things of God that are found within the tabernacle or temple. And that would also include the eating of the set-apart offerings, the eating of the tithes, okay, for the priests. And there are many scholarly theories about why this is required. Does it represent a separation from death and an embracing for life? Is it about wholeness versus sickness? We don't entirely know, and it doesn't matter, because God's rules, they rule. And the priests who were continually serving in the tabernacle and temple, they had some restrictions on their lives and actions because of ritual purity requirements. They could not marry whoever they wanted, for one. But more important to our teaching is they could not approach the altar of God without ritually washing their hands and feet first. And none of the vessels that were used in the temple could be used unless they had been ritually washed. Okay? And no, there was no soap involved, just hand washing. Remember, this wasn't about sanitation as we would recognize it, but about spiritual purity. They washed their hands to show honor to God. Now, sometimes people get the wrong impression that we can't approach God in prayer unless we're ritually unclean, or ritually clean, But that isn't the case at all. We just can't approach his earthly throne, which was what the tabernacle or temple was. Now, this is simplistic. Okay, there is no perfect, well, maybe there are some perfect analogies, but you sure won't ever hear them out of my mouth. Just think of the difference between receiving a phone call from the Queen of England and going to Buckingham Palace to see her. You could do the first laying in bed with mussed-up hair and dirty feet, but you'd better not visit the palace that way because it would be extremely disrespectful. In order to draw near physically, you need to be at your best, and which is the elevated form of yourself. It doesn't have anything to do with what's going on the inside, but we don't approach God any way we want to. But in prayer, we can pray in a ritually defiled state. As a matter of fact, as we'll find out next week, we all do. We're all ritually defiled because of something called corpse impurity, which we all have and is incurable right now. So, we really shouldn't get uppity about it. It's not like we should seek out becoming ritually unclean, but we have to realize that we are. So, like I said, we'll talk about that next week. Now, the Pharisees looked at those priestly requirements for purity on duty, which are biblical. And by this time, priests only served 2 weeks a year, plus feasts. Ever since the time of David, it was a long time since there were only 3 priests in the time of Aaron. And for a while, there were 5 priests, but then you know what happened to was it Nadab and Abihu? Yeah. Yeah, they got nuked with fire from heaven because they were doing stuff disrespectfully in the service of God. So, but since then there were lots and lots of male babies over the years, and so they only had to serve 2 weeks of the year, plus they would all go in at the time of feasts. Now, the Pharisees came up with this idea that the home can also be a sort of a temple, with the dinner table as an altar, and the food upon it as a shared communion between man and God. So very much like the sacrifice without being a sacrifice. This was chulin meat. This was common. This wasn't defiled meat. This wasn't holy meat. It was chulin. It was regular. But they treated it as though they were sharing a meal with God, as they would with the sacrifices. Now, because of this belief, because of this desire to do this, I should say, they took on the priestly mandate to wash hands before eating as a natural extension of this doctrine. Now, as a priest with unwashed hands would defile the sacrifice, especially the food which has been made holy, the Pharisees believed and taught that unwashed hands could defile otherwise perfectly clean food. Now, this is absolutely not scriptural. This is a man-made doctrine derived from legitimate commandments on the priests, and only when they were within the Azarah, the holy precincts. This is a tradition of the elders. And you need to know that there was nothing inherently wrong or evil about doing this. It was a way of life, a lifestyle choice. There was no sin involved. But if they were arguing that unwashed hands made food that was otherwise clean defiled, then we see in Mark 7 that Yeshua was blatantly challenging that idea. Food, of course, is defined by Leviticus 11, and what isn't is not suitable for eating, what isn't is not considered to be food. So to his entirely Jewish audience, when Yeshua talks about food, he is only talking about things that Jews would consider to be food. When we hear the word food, pork and shellfish, when they would hear the word food, pork and shellfish didn't come to mind, or rabbit or catfish or whatever. The Pharisees were claiming that ritually unwashed hands could make something that was clean, could take something that was clean and defile it. Scripturally, there is no evidence for this being true at all, and Yeshua didn't accept it as a ruling, but we will make that into a larger teaching some other time. Up until this point, this has all been pretty easy to understand, unless, of course, I explained it badly. And if I did, I apologize. We're getting to the point now where this is going to be confusing just no matter what I do. And so don't think you're stupid if your head starts spinning. I read this to my husband on our monthly drive to Costco this last week, and he was giving me the stink eye before it was all over. And he's really brilliant, okay? And I will try and make it clear at the end. Of course, we're coming up on the break here, so I'm not going to read it in 15 seconds. But a lot of the stuff that we find in the Mishnah, and this is one of the reasons why we really need commentary, because it only makes sense to people who are familiar with the legal arguments elsewhere and who are already familiar with this way of life. Nobody I know, or have ever known, can look at the Mishnah, which is very brief, and sometimes it doesn't even say what it looks like it's saying. So we're going to come back in just a few minutes, and we're going to go into Berakhot 8:2. Be right back. Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome back to Character and Context, and the rain stopped. So you're not going to hear any thunder bumpers or anything while I'm recording, hopefully this time. Anyway, so we've been talking about the Matthew 23 woes for the last 7 weeks, and we are on the 5th woe right now, which starts, it comprises verses 25 and 26 if you want to follow along in your Bibles. It's about the washing of the outside of the cups and the plates, but Yeshua then rebukes them and says, but you're unclean on the inside. So we're going to talk about what the big deal about that was, why he was rebuking them, what this meant in context, and just stay with me. I'm not going to read all of Berakhot 8:2 and its commentary to you, because I don't want you giving me the stink eye like my husband was giving it to me when I was reading it to him. Okay, so from the introduction, the sages ordain that the hands must be washed ritually before bread is eaten. This washing is termed netilat yadayim. The ritual was instituted because human hands are constantly active and come into contact with unclean objects without conscious direction. So, which means we touch stuff all day without even thinking about it, and we're not meaning to touch things we shouldn't, but we just do because we don't know where they've been. Just think about the handles of the shopping carts. Now, accordingly, the rabbis imposed ritual defilement of the second degree on human hands, which is a very low level of human defilement. When you've got defilement, you've got at the very, very top. We'll talk about this more next week, because this is going to be the big thing next week, is corpse impurity. And we're talking about whitewashed tombs. But like a corpse has the highest degree avi avot hatuma, which means the father of the fathers of ritual uncleanness. It's the worst kind of impurity of all. And whatever received defilement from a corpse, that's even by being in a room with a corpse, which we pretty much all have been, has the degree of hatuma, which is the father of ritual defilement. And so whatever we touch because we've been in the same room or come in contact with a corpse, becomes defiled. One step below that, first degree of defilement, and then the degree under that is second degree of defilement. And that's where all human hands came in the Mishnah. So all human hands during the first century were considered to have this very low level second degree ritual defilement, which could really only defile tithes, free will offerings to the priests, like on Shavuot, and one other thing, and I can't remember right offhand what it is, but maybe I'll think of it later. So the rabbis enacted that even before eating consecrated food, or unconsecrated food, sorry, this is just normal, regular food, there's nothing holy about it, it's just food, one has to wash his hands, as is stated in Haggai 2:5. The hands must be rinsed for unconsecrated food, tithes, and terumah. This is a rabbinic enactment. This is not biblical, which is going to be the disagreement between Yeshua and the Pharisees in Mark 7, actually. So the Gemara adds that this requirement only applies to the eating of bread, but not to the eating of fruit. And actually, it was said in the Gemara that anyone who ritually washes their hands before eating fruit is arrogant and presumptuous. However, if the fruit is wet, that's a different thing altogether. Or if the food is being dipped in liquids, then the hands must be ritually washed. It's because then you've touched it with unwashed hands that have the second degree of ritual impurity. It can come in contact with the water or the honey or the vinegar or whatever, and then it would make the honey, the wine, or vinegar defiled. Now, like I said, this is all not biblical. This is just stuff that they decided. Okay, that's why it says rabbinic enactment. Something that isn't in the text, but they decided that they were going to do this. And that's their choice to live that way. Okay. I don't have a problem with it. I don't do it. I don't have a problem with it. And Yeshua didn't actually rebuke them for doing it. We need to make that clear, too. All right, but let's talk about Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. This is the commentary on the actual Berakhot 8.2. Now, and I hope this makes sense, because it's confusing when you don't live that way. And I probably didn't describe it the best, but, we're just going to go on and you get the overview that it was a complex situation, that they were imposing these regulations on themselves, and they tried to impose them on Yeshua too and his disciples. Now, Beit Shammai argues as follows: when wine is poured out, it can spill and wet the outer side of the cup. Now, if the hands of the person holding the cup were unwashed, they would, by a rabbinic decree, cause the wine on the outside of the cup to become first degree of ritual impurity, which in turn would cause the cup to become defiled, as was explained in the introduction. So, unwashed hands transferred impurity to any liquid that splashed on the outside of the cup, which rendered the inside of the cup unclean. Now, the rabbis, however, limited the application of the defilement they decreed to the outer side of the vessel. Okay, I just told you wrong. The defilement does not extend to the handle of the vessel. So if you had a little cup thing, a little cup holder like on the teacup, that the defilement didn't go there. Okay? If the outer side of the vessel contracted defilement from a liquid, only its outer side is defiled, but its inner side, rim, hanger, and handles remain ritually pure. So see, I even told you wrong, because this is still very confusing to me. Beit Shammai, however, held that it is also forbidden by rabbinic decree to use the vessel, the outer side of which has become impure, since drops might spill over and become defiled through contact with the sides and convey impurity to the hands holding the cup. Hence, only an undefiled cup is used, and the hands are washed to prevent the outer side of the cup from being defiled in the first place. Now, Beit Hillel allowed the use of the cup, the outer side of which is ritually unclean. So, Beit Hillel says it doesn't matter if the outside of the cup is unclean. Now, if one were to rinse his hands first, he may fail to dry them completely. The moisture still clinging to his hands would come defiled through contact with the outer side of the cup and would defile his hands. He would then eat his meal with ritually unclean hands. So after he uses the cup, he rinses his hands and proceeds to eat his meal with ritually pure hands. Now you see why this is so... It's confusing, and the different houses had different rulings about when you would wash your hands and why, based on if they thought that the outside of the cup was impure or not, and what that would do to your hands before you ate bread. So it all boils down to Hillel believing that the outside of the cup can be unclean regardless of whether or not the inside is clean. And so the most important surface to clean is the inside. And Shammai saying that the outer surface is the most important, that it could be clean even if the inside was not. Now Yeshua kind of sided with Hillel by turning all this into a picture of who we really are. Are we only cleaned up on the outside for show, or are we really filthy on the inside? Really, this is just an extension of everything that's gone before. Long tassels, wide tefillin, wanting honors and authority, making showy oaths that meant nothing, painstakingly tithing, even to on the slightest things, while not truly caring for the needy who were the whole purpose for the tithe. This is the clean outside of the cup, and I say clean in quotation marks. But this is hypocrisy. They should have worn the tassels and their tefillin and tithed generously, let their yes be yes and their no be no, and received the honor and authority that came from being righteous and honorable from the inside out. Yes, the inside or the outside of the cup should absolutely be clean. But it's only going through the motions if the inside is filthy. And we all start out with filthy insides, right? And people like me, filthy outsides as well. This walk with God, this transformation that comes through the cross is all about changing us on the inside and the outside, and not just on the inside. You want amazing rule keepers? Join any crazy cult. Or become a Muslim, a Buddhist, or a Hindu and watch them keep rules better than we do. Almost anyone, no matter how depraved, can be moved to keep external laws. And the Pharisees knew the Torah better than anyone I'm talking to right now. Unless Yeshua is listening. And if he does, I hope that he'll keep me from making any more mistakes in my confusion. They knew the Torah inside and out. They kept it better than we will ever keep it in every external way that counted. And yet there was no transformation on the inside. Okay? Now, I want to just hit on Mark 7 really briefly, and we'll do a full teaching on Mark 7 sometime, but this ties in. Now, the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. Now, the Pharisees, this is in parentheses, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So, this is talking about exactly what we've been talking here. They went to the marketplace. They touched a bunch of stuff. They didn't know if they had contracted ritual impurity. They assumed they had, so they did the ritual washing, the netilat yadayim. And, okay, so going back. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders instead of eating food with defiled hands? Remember, that defilement was presumed. It's not biblical. It's a rabbinic ordinance. And Yeshua replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. And he continued, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father and mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their mother or father is korban, meaning devoted to God, that you no longer let them do anything for their mother or father. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you've handed down, and you do many things like that. And I want you to notice that he didn't even address the washing. He didn't say, you can't do this. He totally changed the subject. He says, you're challenging me on this, and look at the horrible things that you're allowing others to oppress people, and you're oppressing people yourselves sometimes. Doesn't mean everyone was, but it means that as a group they had some rules that allowed people to oppress even their parents. Now again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen to me, everyone, understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. And this he's talking about unwashed hands here. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. After he had left the crowd and entered the house, the disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull? He asked. Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? So he's saying eating with unwashed hands isn't going to defile you. For it doesn't go into the heart, but into the stomach and then out of the body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean, and of course we know that he was speaking to a Jewish audience, so we know what foods meant. It didn't mean absolutely anything you put into your mouth. It meant what Jews would consider to be food as per Leviticus 11 and the rest of the Bible. Now he went on, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these come from inside and defile a person. And, Paul will mention these all just about in Galatians when he's talking about the works of the flesh, and contrasted with the works of the Spirit. So So again, this makes this clearer. He's talking about they thought that their hands had the second degree of ritual defilement and would defile normal food. And Yeshua is saying, no, that's ridiculous. That's not the case. It doesn't defile your food. He didn't tell them they couldn't do it, but he said that it was an invalid teaching to say that it would defile the food. Let's look at Luke 11. Same thing. When Jesus had finished speaking, this is starting in verse 37, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. So the last one, it said his disciples weren't doing it. Here it says Jesus isn't doing it either. Then the Lord said to him, now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish. Of course, we're going back to this whole debate between Hillel and Shammai about the outside of the cup and dish. But inside you are full of greed and wickedness, you foolish people. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean to you. And of course, he's not talking about foods that are not meant to be foods. He's talking about your unconsecrated food will be clean for you. Your hands aren't going to change that. So over and over and over again, we see this, that they're straining. Last week we talked about straining gnats and allowing camels to slip by. Again, this is exactly what this is. It's the same thing. They're worried about the cleanliness of their hands, and not as much about the cleanliness of their hearts, what's on the inside. Now, I want you to notice again, I'm going to stress this, he never says they can't wash their hands or their vessels. He's pointing out to them the weightier matter that they should be focusing on first and foremost, just to be clear. All this washing was okay, although he categorically denies the Pharisaic belief that one could render clean foods impure by touching them with unwashed hands. But he doesn't tell them, that all the washing is a sin. He only puts it in perspective, and according to Luke, he does not ritually wash his own hands before eating bread. Clean food is clean, period. And, we're so hard on the Pharisees, okay, and the scribes. We are, because we look at them and going, oh, look at what they're doing. But there's always an application where we're doing this ourselves. It's a big problem with people who are new to Torah, all right? People who did not grow up keeping the commandments, suddenly we see them becoming rabidly focused on externals, and the easier commandments, but turning into terrorists. And I don't use that word lightly. And sure, they're not blowing up buildings, but they are oftentimes blowing up relationships, friendships. They're destroying ties with people who they could be a light to over a very few commandments, and always the easier ones. Let's face it. You find out about the tassels, and people become more rabid about wearing them than the Jews, even. And they wear them in ways that the Jews never would. And I'm not saying they can't do that. I'm saying that it's an external thing. And I put the mezuzah on the door. And don't get me wrong, I have a mezuzah on the door with the Shema in it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if what's going on inside the house doesn't match what's on the mezuzah, then that mezuzah is just an external. If you wear the tassels, but you're getting in fights on the Sabbath, well, what good were your tassels? You're not guarding peace on the Sabbath. You're acting like Pharaoh, making demands. And people just begin to behave insufferably, and they get backlash. And a lot of times they consider it that they're persecuted or they're martyrs, when actuality, it's consequences for behaving badly, for suddenly calling people who keep the majority of commandments that can be kept, which is Christians, and saying that they're not in covenant just because they don't keep the same Sabbath, because they don't keep the feasts, because they're not taking the right party days, because they're eating a few foods that are forbidden, and all of a sudden it doesn't matter that they're feeding the poor and visiting the sick and reaching out to the lost. All those things don't matter because they're not doing what we do. And so we take the party commandments and the food commandments and wearing tassels. This is all easy stuff. And so we start deciding who is and who is not in covenant based on it, based on our externals, because keeping the Sabbath and the feast and wearing the tassels and the food, it's external things. It doesn't require for us to have circumcised hearts at all. It doesn't require us to have obedient hearts. It's external rules. Like I said, Muslims keep external rules better than we do. Hindus, Buddhists, and everything, they can, and cults, goodness sakes. Keeping rules doesn't make one clean on the inside. It only cleans you up on the outside. But if it's turning you into a monster, then they're having the opposite effect. And I actually have this theory that God will often reveal the keeping of more of the Torah to the people who are the most insufferable, so he can show us just how horrible we're capable of being over a few commandments, while completely ignoring the weightier ones. We get bogged down in externals, just like the Pharisees, when we need to be doing the hard work to become different people on the inside and then have that manifesting as love on the outside. And then the tassels mean something, and they aren't just a turn-off and an abomination to people. Then we can truly keep the Sabbath by being at peace and by injecting peace into the lives of others, and not be acting like Pharaoh, and not constantly be making demands, not be bashing people on a day that is supposed to be an island of peace. We're not supposed to be working that day. And we're not supposed to be acting like Pharaoh. We're not supposed to be making demands. We're not supposed to be beating people like the slave drivers. Sometimes we know how to take commandments and we just defile them in our immature zeal when we're not really thinking about what we're supposed to be doing. And the feast, I see people who are very, very vocal all year about not celebrating Christmas and Easter, and then when the feasts come around, they don't know what to do. Or they're too busy telling people, well, you can't do that, it's rabbinic. Or you can't do that because it's not in the Bible. And so I don't know what they do other than sit at home from work eating. Because the Bible doesn't really, the Bible says rejoice. The Bible doesn't say how you are to rejoice. So let's let people rejoice. Sometimes people get in this trap, and this is really, really, really sad. Really sad. People get in this trap of thinking that, because there's the one side where people are just saying, if it's not in the Bible, don't do it, and they become terrorists that way. But then some people fall prey to some teachers who can be terrorists. And this isn't just among Messianic Jews. This is among some, well-meaning teachers within the Hebrew Roots movement. But they get this idea that you have to be Jewish in order to please God. And the more Jewish you are, especially according to modern day standards of Judaism, the more pleasing you are. And you'll see them, they'll forsake their actual given names. They'll take on a Hebrew name, even though Junia and Apollos didn't. And many other, they didn't have Hebrew names. We see most of the people mentioned by Paul, not only didn't they have Hebrew names, but they never adopted Hebrew names either. They had Greek names, and actually a lot of the Jews, like Apollos was a Jew from Alexandria, and he never had a Hebrew name, and he didn't get rid of Apollos. I mean, come on, it's Apollos. That was the Roman form of not the Roman form, that was a Greek god, Apollos. And he never changed his name. We have to get away from this idea that we have to take on externals in order to be acceptable to God, as though the externals are more important than the internals. Internals are always more important, and that's what Yeshua has been talking about throughout the Woes, and we will get to unwashed tombs next week, and you take care. I'll see you later.